Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the April 18th service event of the North Texas Church of Freethought. So I planned to present this last week, but it wasn't quite fully baked. It was only kind of half baked. It's better now, but I'm still not entirely happy with it. And I think it's good to remember Voltaire's observation, the best is the enemy of the good. What a great little nugget of wisdom. Too bad it's not in the Holy Bible. So I hope you'll enjoy what you're about to see in here and find something useful in it. Last week, I presented some quotes outlining and somewhat foreshadowing today's service on the very large and complicated subject you see on your screen there, the brain, the mind, the soul, and the spirit. I began thinking about this initially without the last term, spirit, but then I found that some distinguish it from the soul, as you will see, and I think it's important, so I added that. As usual, you can and should form your own opinions. If you're seeing this on YouTube after the actual live event, which we will post later today, please click the little bell or other icon that will notify you of new uploads. Please go to our website. You see it at the bottom of the screen there, and it's also down in the comments below. We have a lot of material there. Please, when you go to the website, click on the PayPal, send us $1, send us $100, whatever you can spare if you like what you see and believe that we're helping to promote what matters to you. So, what are these things? The brain, the mind, the soul, and the spirit. Or better, and instead of people always wanting to define things, let's just better ask, what do people mean by these terms? What is their basis in human experience, and how do they relate to one another? And this is how I think we usually think of them, that the brain is what we really are, and somehow the mind is in the brain, so the brain gives rise to the mind, and then the soul and the spirit are parts of the mind, or maybe the other way around, but somehow, in some way, independent from our thoughts. This way of looking at it seems sensible because the brain, after all, is an objectively existing thing, and we know a lot about it, though in another sense we know next to nothing about the brain. But we cannot perceive minds or souls or spirits. Souls and spirits aside, we cannot even directly perceive minds except for our own. So what they really are is ambiguous. The famous Turing test, this is a great subject for another time, by the way. This is supposed to be able to distinguish between human minds and clever machine imitations, but notice it doesn't measure minds. It relies on expressions of speech or text as assessed by this judge or interrogator or here the human questioner. Alan Turing found a very clever way to sidestep the question of how to tell if one is interacting with a mind or not. It's just your subjective opinion. And we have to ask ourselves, would you pass the Turing test? So this modern perspective, and though it seems very natural and sensible, is the opposite of how these ideas actually developed. This is undoubtedly how it really happened over time, from spirit to soul to mind to brain. Keep in mind that over time is an important context, and that context is since the beginning of there being people who could ask the fundamental questions of what am I? What sort of being am I? Which is to say, where do I fit in? And now that I'm here, what is to become of me? Recorded history goes back about 5,000 years to the time of the Sumerians and their cuneiform script, about 2600 BCE. Notice, though, how this timeline here is crazy distorted, with history to the right actually being well less than 0.2% of that total 3 million years. History was a very late innovation for our species. Way to the left on this timeline, in that dark green box, were the Neanderthals, from whom many of us inherited some of our genes. 50,000 years ago, and perhaps longer ago than that, the Neanderthals buried their dead, used ornaments and pigments, and left other evidences of their having had some sort of culture. And we can only speculate, of course, about what that culture might have been. We do have good reason to believe that Neanderthals could talk, because they have found hyoid bones, a little horseshoe-shaped bone in your throat, which is important for speech. The Neanderthals definitely possessed cognitive abilities beyond that needed for basic survival. And one has to ask, how long had that gone on? Ideas and thoughts, sadly, do not leave fossils. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux in France have been dated to about 1,500 to 17,000 years ago, much earlier than some of the remains of the Neanderthals. Surely the people responsible for this art could think, plan, and wonder about their existence as we do. Now, what would our most distant ancestors have thought about? The first ones who were self-aware enough, who had sufficient excess cognitive capacity to wonder about something more than just where their next meal was coming from. In particular, what would they have noticed and thought about themselves, their existence, and what we now call the human condition or the human predicament? That really was the fall of man, wasn't it? The fall from paradise is emerging out of the animal condition into wondering, what the heck is this world doing to me? The Neanderthals probably would not have started doing this when they were doing some challenging task like hunting or carrying spears or doing something. More likely it first happened when they were doing something boring like scraping animal hides. They certainly would not have started by considering themselves a bunch of body parts. They probably saw a lot more of these than most of us today, considering that they were regularly butchering animals and probably each other at times. And we know that the ancient Egyptians, tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago to us, well, tens of hundreds, but tens or hundreds of thousands of years in the future of the Neanderthals, thought so little of that goopy stuff in people's heads that they removed and discarded it when they made mummies. No, the most obvious thing about oneself and other people, and especially living people as opposed to dead ones, and about animals as well, is breathing. Our earliest ancestors would also have noticed that this air or wind coming into and going out of their bodies was closely related to what they were doing and how they felt. It would have been equally obvious and equally mysterious that death is when breath goes out of someone, and that even voluntarily holding one's breath quickly causes distress and panic. Did they then connect what we recognize as natural movements of air with breathing? Might they have wondered whether a welcome breeze was a kindly deceased family member or friend, some breath that had gone out of someone? Or maybe a gust of wind that blew sand in their faces was a warning or reprimand from someone who had died, but who was still with them in some way, wanting to warn them or otherwise interact. It's a very small step from there to the idea of deities and the idea that proper handling of dead bodies was of paramount importance. Maybe this is why people first began to bury the dead and clean them up and otherwise treat them with respect. As good Bible worshipers know, it says right in Genesis that God, when he made Adam, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So obviously God breathes. It says so in the Bible. Doesn't that mean that God has lungs? God must need oxygen to survive, right? That's obvious to us, but it wouldn't have been to the people of Bible times because they didn't know anything about those things. But words like inspire and inspiration still refer to the act of inhaling, as well as to being filled with the ability or urge to do something. And to expire still means to die. Notice that sometimes the Genesis translation is that man became a living being, and in other cases, a living soul. And we'll get to souls in just a bit. It's worth considering the qualia, or what it was like aspect of considering these things for our distant ancestors. They deserve credit for coming up with these ideas, but it was the best they could do with what they had. Just imagine not knowing the kind of thing you're seeing on the screen there. Imagine not knowing all the things we take so much for granted today. We scarcely think of them. Imagine not even having the words to describe most of human anatomy or physiology. Yes, our distant ancestors probably saw more actual lungs than most of us do today. How many of you have seen lungs? I have, but I think a lot of other people have never seen lungs. But those people knew next to nothing about the anatomy of the lungs, much less their microscopic structure. They knew nothing about the actual function of the lungs, about the gas exchange that takes place in the lungs and why it's important. That understanding was still many thousands of years in the future. But another idea was needed, and this is because no one at any time has or ever has had a sense of being their breath. So an idea like a soul is needed, something that could account for the larger first-person experience of being human in general, and of being oneself specifically, with all of one's hopes and fears, personality and character, attitudes, memories and abilities, and so on. Well, this is a little clip out of the Dr. Strange movie, I believe, that shows his soul being knocked out of his body. So we're scarcely beyond our ancestors in understanding how such things can be generated, just the mind and what we call the soul, by these soggy assemblages of meat, bone, and blood that we are. So it's hard to fault those ancestors. In fact, it's tempting to praise them for coming up with this idea that humans, and perhaps animals as well, are physical material bodies inhabited by incorporeal or immaterial breath or spirits or souls. Another term is ghosts. And if there can be bodies without souls, dead bodies in other words, then why not souls without bodies? It's a natural conclusion, a natural progression. Who has not dreamed of a loved one who has died? Very realistically, I remember dreaming of one of my parents when my dad died, that seeing him in a dream and even saying, wait a minute, you're dead. And he'd say, well, of course I am. And then he went on to behave like he did in life. Dreams are another subject for another day, of course, but the idea that dreams are unreal, that they are images and events invented by our brains during sleep, is a very modern idea. How could you even have that idea without the modern understanding of what the brain is doing? The traditional belief was that dreams happened in another world or dimension or plane of existence. Of course, it's always a higher plane of existence, right? Remember the Aborigines and their dream time, literally thinking of another world that you visit in your dreams. And this idea persists today, mainly when it comes to NDEs, near-death experiences, the images and events created by the brain, at least sometimes under conditions of extreme oxygen deprivation. And we'll get to more on that in a bit. It's reasonable to suppose that the idea of the mind came after that of souls and spirits. To some degree, they may all get conflated, but it seems that there is another concept, another term that's needed to refer to immediate awareness and the ability to direct one's attention in a purposeful way. And this may actually have come later in human evolution. There's a very interesting work by a guy called, it's a long title, it's called The Breakdown of Consciousness, or rather The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The author is Julian Jaynes. That's another thing to look up, very useful, very interesting. But we need something with which to figure things out, and by means of which one can, as Socrates put it 400 years before Christ was supposed to have been around, know thyself. And this is something, this mind is something that goes away or is lost when we sleep and become unconscious. Do you think anything when you're asleep? Well, there's lucid dreaming, and people do wake up with ideas of how to solve problems. But generally speaking, one can be considered offline when asleep or otherwise unconscious, while the reappearance not just of one's mind, but of everything else about oneself upon awakening shows that the soul or spirit was in some way still there. Finally, after tens of thousands of years, battlefield doctors began to recognize, this is still in ancient times, people that were trying to treat the wounded on the battlefield noticed that head injuries often had predictable effects on sensation and movement, and curiously enough, on the opposite side of the body. And it was noticed that head injuries often led to altered mental function and also to seizures. By the time of the 4th century BCE, Hippocrates held that the brain was the seat of intelligence. About the same time, Aristotle continued to teach that the heart was where human intelligence originated. Aristotle thought that the brain was only a cooling mechanism for the blood, and people having big heads just had more cooling, so they weren't so hot-blooded as animals. Our language contains the fossils of these kinds of past beliefs when people say they learn or know things, quote unquote, by heart. It may seem long ago, and it was, but the establishment of the first known school of anatomy was not until 275 BCE, more than halfway through even recorded history. But obviously it took many more centuries to unravel the structure and function of the human body. It wasn't until even the 17th century that the circulation of the blood was shown. That's William Harvey down at the bottom there. By the way, he was a bit of a misogynist if you read about the man, but what the heck, all of our ancestors, even the great ancestors also, many of them had great faults. So how to sort out these different but related ideas? If that seems confusing, it should be. Because of Bible verses, Christianity, including Catholicism, if you go look on their website and their catechism, they distinguish between soul and spirit. Supposedly, your soul is who you are, but your spirit is something different, or according to some, it's part of your soul, in which case it would not be different, or at least not separate. That is your connection to God. So take a look at these different diagrams, let your eyes run over there. I mean, each of which purports to make it understandable, and yet it seems like you could just draw any kind of random Venn diagram and it would fit with the supernaturalism. And as with all supernaturalism, it's rather incoherent. The famous Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas tried to make something of this whole soul business. He said that there are different varieties of souls. So, for example, even plants have vegetative souls. Animals have sensitive souls since they can move and feel. But only humans, and only after a certain point in fetal development, have rational souls. So for Aquinas, an early termination of pregnancy in the first trimester or so would not be murder, according to that Catholic authority. It might still be wrong, but it wouldn't be murder. Of course, you can always take the absurd and make it a lot more complicated, and then, at least for many people, then it will make sense. This is the meaning of the saying that complexity is the wisdom of fools. We freethinkers sometimes forget this. Just because so many truths are complicated doesn't mean that something very complicated must be true. A book that weighs 10 pounds and has 1,000 footnotes may be an excellent book, but it is not necessarily more to be trusted than a book that only weighs a pound and only has 10 or even no references. Now this is interesting. Plato, in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, written more than 400 years before the earliest New Testament writings, develops the idea that a human being, and specifically the soul, the important essence of a person, or who they really are, consists of different parts. He reached this idea by the simple observation. It's in this dialogue you could read. All the Platonic dialogues are quite readable. But he just simply observed, the people in dialogue observed that people experience conflicts in themselves. People have urges that pull them in different directions. So Plato asserted that there had to be different parts, and in fact he said there are 3 parts, each with different values, desires, and motivations. Plato used the example of a charioteer pulled by 2 horses. The one horse is motivated by honor and pursues victory. It has courage, but is susceptible to anger and envy. The other horse seeks to satisfy more basic urges and pursues money, pleasure, and other physical gratifications that can turn into gluttony and greed. But the charioteer who holds the reins is reason, who must apply truth and wisdom to guide the course of the entire assemblage. Plato's Socrates, who discussed all these things in the dialogue, says that the horses have wings, so this is not quite accurate. They should be winged horses, and that figures into the allegory because flying higher or lower, higher is always good, that's also part of the allegory. I found on the internet someone who had tattooed this image on themselves. If you just saw that random walking down the street, would you know what that's about? That's Plato's allegory of the soul. And another artist depicted the whole arrangement going awry, things going off the rails, so to speak. In the Bhagavad Gita, dated to a couple hundred years after Plato, so maybe they got the idea from him, or maybe the idea was current in the time. Sometime in the 2nd century BCE, this is another chariot allegory. In this version, the horses are the 5 senses, controlled by the reins of the mind, held by the intellect, and the soul is just a passenger. And there are more complicated versions of this as well. Well, but here's another version of the tripartite self. Most of us are familiar with this. But this relates to Plato's allegory, doesn't it? And to some other things, as we'll see in a moment. The French philosopher, the famous French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, came along in the 17th century. While he made great contributions, what is called Cartesian dualism continues to be a troubling idea. It was not original, obviously, since there had been this body-soul or mind-matter dichotomy going on in people's heads for a long time. But Descartes asserted that mind is a kind of substance, not a material physical substance. And he said that human beings are a combination of this material corporeal body and an immaterial incorporeal, that is to say, supernatural mind or soul. Supposedly, they somehow make a connection in the pineal gland in the brain. We talked about this impossible problem before. How does an immaterial thing interact with a material thing? In the 21st century, we're more used to thinking about Freud's version of the tripartite human mind, comprised of the ego, the superego, and the id, with the added feature that there's also a lot of our mental lives that takes place behind the scenes, either in subconsciousness or preconsciousness, which is accessible at least to some degree, or in the unconscious, which we're not normally aware of at all. There is less emphasis these days on the ego, superego, id business, but the idea of the unconscious remains solid. And I think we can see this in our everyday experience. Certainly the idea of the preconsciousness or subconsciousness is even proved easily in everyday life. What, for example, I ask you, is the capital of France? Now, where was your knowledge or belief that it is Paris before I asked that question? As you may know, it has also been suggested that Freud's principles and method of psychoanalysis may not be scientific, inasmuch as they make few, if any, testable predictions, and they're difficult or impossible to refute. After all, if you agree with the Freudian psychiatrist's assessment of your problems, then you know it's right, and if you disagree with it, it just shows that you're in reaction formation. You're in denial because you can't handle the truth. One thing is for sure, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And by the way, there is no evidence, here you'll learn something new today, no reason for even supposing that Freud ever said or wrote this. And that, by the way, is the name he was given at birth, not Sigmund, but Sigismund Shlomo Freud. And despite everything and anything else about Freud, he had much to say that remains important and useful in thinking about the human mind. He deserves recognition as a trailblazing freethinker. There still is a lot of woo-woo, or just woo out there, unscientific, irrational, and ridiculous ideas that fall under the head of popular metaphysics, mysticism, and implausible, quote-unquote, alternative medicine. I can assure you, if you go to your bookstore, if there are any brick-and-mortar bookstores anymore, and you look in the metaphysical section, you're not going to see serious works of philosophy about existence, being, identity, or time and space. Here's one from an outfit that claims to be involved in research into spiritual science. And by the way, the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, a division of the National Institutes of Health, paid for with your tax dollars, has been spending money on such things, on energy medicine and the like. I haven't looked in a while, but they were funding these things routinely. And here we have the soul spirit leaving the body stuff again, now made to seem scientific, especially when it comes to near-death experiences. Of course, any human experiences are suitable for study and analysis, but is there such a thing as an association for drunken studies or an association for intoxication studies? Why is that? But having a memory, if it really is a memory, of a weird experience in connection with almost dying means that there is intense scientific interest in what you have to say. And this is connected with, obviously, undeniably, the claim that death is only a doorway to an afterlife, and that something of our consciousness or soul survives the death of the body. It's an attractive and comforting thought for many people, one rooted deeply in our species for reasons we've reviewed already. But there is no scientific evidence, none, that there is any survival of human consciousness after death. This guy, Bruce Grayson, a physician and one of the founders of that IANDS outfit, is out with a book now on the subject, the title of which quite clearly declares his belief. I heard him on NPR recently. In fact, hearing that determined me to address this subject, which had been on my mind for quite a while. And I don't recall during his interview that he said anything outright false, but he did not admit, much less call attention to facts showing that, or the many other reasons why, NDEs do not point to anything after death. For example, psychedelic drugs and other causes of brain dysfunction cause similar experiences as NDEs. So they're not really NDEs, they're just anomalous brain experiences that can be caused by more than being near death. But if consciousness is independent of brain function, why should any sort of brain dysfunction affect the experience of consciousness? That is, if it is asserted that the soul or consciousness is a kind of operator or driver of the brain which can be compared to a car, how about that, an update of the chariot idea, then while a temporarily impaired brain may cause temporary outward impairments of behavior, including clinical death, the soul or consciousness should be unaffected, right? After all, in the case of a car, you get a flat tire, the taillight is broken, it doesn't affect you, the driver. This ad hoc explanation that we're supposed to accept, indeed the whole argument of believers in these near-death experiences as proof of an afterlife, the idea is that such circumstances temporarily decouple or detach the soul from the brain. Fine, but then why does, say, damage to the visual cortex cause blindness and damage to Broca's area cause speech and language impairments if the soul can float around without the brain and hear and see things? Why can't someone like Helen Keller just use their soul's independent ability to see and hear instead of their eyes and ears? Oh, wait, I forgot. That's because the soul is so firmly tethered to the brain. So in other words, there is a tight connection between the material brain and the immaterial mind or soul or spirit, or the subtle body or whatever you want to call it. There's this tight connection. Well, except when there's not. There is no case of properly diagnosed brain death where the person recovered. You'll find this all over the internet too, people saying that this person was diagnosed brain dead. Have there been improper diagnoses or misdiagnoses of brain death where the person recovered? Guess what? Yes, just as there have been misdiagnoses of many other diseases and conditions. One of our church members, in fact, one of us who's here today, was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer because of a misreading of a chest x-ray that actually showed old lung disease. Sadly, it happens. But if an actually brain dead person, someone whose brain has actually died, ever recovers, you can bet it will be sensational worldwide news, and that person would be studied to the hilt to find out how they can behave as if they're alive with a dead brain. Or maybe that will be the zombie apocalypse and all us normal people will be running for our lives. During Dr. Grayson's interview on NPR, he also talked about out-of-body experiences of people undergoing medical procedures who later recounted floating out of their bodies and being able to recall some conversation or music that was playing even though they were anesthetized. Now, it is the case that people can be aware or can recall such things when they are under anesthesia, especially depending how deeply they are anesthetized and by what anesthetic agents. As someone who does surgery from time to time, I can tell you there are times that I will say to the anesthesiologist, this patient is light. You got to do something about that. She's moved her leg over here or something like that. But that is obviously no evidence for an immaterial soul spirit. There are also stories of people recounting something they could not possibly have perceived unless they did actually float out of their bodies. And the classic story is someone seeing what's on the back of an operating room light or something of that kind. Although a lot of people believe this has happened, I've been unable to find any documented case where it actually has. It's an urban legend. Likewise with OOBEs or out-of-body experiences or remote viewing. There's never been credible evidence that someone left their body and learned something they could not have learned or guessed in any other way. Think of it now, really, if such things were possible, why do we send robot spacecraft to Mars? Why do we do CAT scans and MRI scans or exploratory surgery on people? You could just have some adept go out of their body and investigate for us. Notice something else about these alleged OOBEs, remote viewing, or near-death experiences understood as something of the same sort, as well as sightings of ghosts. In order for an incorporeal, immaterial soul spirit to see or hear anything, it would have to be able to interact with such material things as photons and compression waves in air, sound waves. That was Descartes' problem, which he thought could be solved with the pineal gland. But now notice also that anything that can interact with physical phenomena, even the pineal gland, would therefore be detectable and measurable. You would be able to tell that there was something about the pineal gland that was not behaving the way material things ordinarily would. This is what detecting and measuring is. It's sampling something and seeing whether it shows that the thing you're looking for is there or not. So if, for example, a disembodied subtle body or soul spirit could sample photons and sound waves, then another instrument could detect photons disappearing and sound waves being absorbed without explanation. And with what could these soul spirits or subtle bodies perceive sights and sounds without retinas or tympanic membranes, eardrums, connected to the cochlea, not to mention functioning brains? Oh, right, I almost forgot. It's a miracle. But again, if disembodied soul spirits can do all that, why do they have any need of corporeal bodies at all? And that brings us right back to the supernaturalist's basic claim that souls require brains and bodies except when they don't. And how can we tell when and whether they do or they don't? Well, if they do, they do, and if they don't, they don't. Simple. And that's the way it seems to the supernaturalists. They just don't see any difficulty with that. Well, we're not talking about ghost sightings. That's another topic we could talk about another day, but there are the same problems there. If you can see a ghost, then the ghost is emitting or reflecting or otherwise interacting with photons. If you can hear a ghost, then it's making sound waves. If a ghost is knocking things over, then it can only be doing so by some physical interaction with those things that's disturbing. And all these things would be detectable and measurable. I mean, really, that 1984 film, Ghostbusters, if you haven't seen it, you need to go back and watch it. It makes much more sense what they're doing than what the mainstream supernaturalists are talking about. Another thing Dr. Grayson brought up during his interview on NPR is what is called terminal lucidity. L-U-I-C-I-D-I-T-Y. Did I say that right? L-U-C-I-D-I-T-Y. These are accounts of people who just before they die become like their old selves, recognizing friends and relatives that advanced dementia had caused them to be unable to recognize and being unusually with it when they were not expected to be. Well, Dr. Grayson opined that this was strong evidence that there is some supernatural soul or mind that is independent of the brain. It is, of course, true that seriously ill people, including those with advanced dementia, have their good days and bad days. Many of us who have seen a relative or friend go through this process of decline have seen this. This is plausibly related to moment-to-moment medical and nutritional status, as well as the time of day, and all sorts of other situational factors. I saw my own mother in the ICU. They were ready to turn off all the machines, and I inquired what she was being given in her IV, and I discovered she was not being given any kind of nutrition. It was just salt water, basically, and I said, why don't you give her the kind that's got a little sugar in it? And within a few hours, she perked up. Of course, a diabetic who's ever been through an insulin reaction, you know the same thing. You know, you're not all there, but then you are all there when your sugar recovers to normal levels. This could also be plausibly related to moment-to-moment medical nutritional status, not just that, what I mentioned, but as well as the time of day and all sorts of other situational factors. Even the clothing worn by visitors or background sounds may have an effect on those with declining cognitive function. But even if terminal lucidity, sometimes also called the last hurrah, could be well characterized, how would anything about it, least of all our ignorance about it, help to substantiate the idea of the soul as driver of the body of the car idea? Can a driver, by force of will, cause a flat tire or a broken taillight to suddenly start working properly? Clearly, supernaturalists would have us believe that this can happen, except when it doesn't, of course. Now, I should mention that the philosophers have not let go of the immaterial soul in the material body either. One idea, which goes back to Descartes, and even before him to this Persian Muslim polymath Avicenna, who lived in he was born in 980 and died in 1037. He said that we can imagine ourselves as bodiless, immaterial beings floating or flying with no sensory or motor connection with our bodies, not being able to see or hear anything or feel our bodies. If we could still know that we exist without having any connection to our body, it would prove that we are souls and not bodies, or that we could not doubt that one is or has an immaterial soul. Obviously, this is not the case. I mean, come on, folks. For one thing, one conducts the thought experiment with one's brain. Without a brain, there is no thought experiment. For another, even if one could wipe out all sensory input from the mind, and of course, that calls to mind sensory deprivation tanks, right? They've done some interesting studies with that, including even if you could wipe out the internal body sensations like proprioceptions. That's not one of the five senses. Remember the five horses? You need a lot more than five horses. Proprioception is knowing where and in what state our body parts are in, such as whether one's arms are at one's sides or whether we're holding them over our head and so on. One still has the mental inputs of all one's prior experiences as well. We have all the knowledge, which includes the notions of existence, of bodies and souls. Even Descartes misses the fact that to express the idea, I think, therefore I am, necessitates that one has somehow learned a language in which to express it. And all those things depend on one's brain. That one can imagine something simply does not make it real. In fact, Avicenna's proof of the soul, this flying man, floating man idea, is reminiscent of the ontological proof of God, the claim that if one imagines a perfect deity, then that deity must exist because existence is necessarily an aspect of perfection. Gosh. We may call this proving things with words. This consists of asserting that a word has some sort of rigid definition that reflects its essence or essential property, and then that is used to, quote, logically deduce, unquote, the desired belief, and more importantly, what it is desired that you believe. The ancients called this sophistry, or making the worse appear the better, as they put it. So, for example, supernaturalists often attack naturalism by defining it as the belief that only material things, matter and energy, exist. And this is also how they subtly imply, though they just as often outright insist, that naturalism, atheism, is an ideology or a religion. But if they can get it accepted that people who reject supernaturalism take the position that nothing exists but material things, this is where they go with it. That ideas and other things are not matter and energy, and therefore what we believe is false. Our ideology, atheism, is false. But the foundation of our approach to understanding is not, and should not be, that only material things exist. Heck, how could we say such a thing, inasmuch as physicists now tell us that material things are really immaterial fields? We say only that objective reality refers to everything for which there is objective evidence, evidence that is open to anyone and everyone, that does not depend on who is doing the perceiving, or that we can build machines. And in some cases, we must rely on such instruments on machines. We can't perceive X-rays, but we believe in them because we can build machines that perceive them for us. And we don't define it that way either. We just say that that is what we mean by saying that something is objective. It's a very simple idea. So it is frustrating when people get confused, and quite disheartening when some people deliberately, appear to deliberately anyway, make it confusing by claiming, for example, that there is such a thing as objective morality. Now, of course, the notion of objective reality is tautological, which is to say what we mean by the term is virtually built into it, like mathematics, which begins with axioms and reaches no new knowledge which does not rely on those axioms. It's already there. The idea of objective reality flows out of the idea of objective evidence, that some of our perceptions can be perceived by others. It's like, wow, you mean you didn't dream when I dreamed last night? You were in the dream, you weren't there? No, that must be subjective. That's how we determine whether something is subjective or objective, whether it's part of our internal world or whether it's part of objective reality. And this is why such things as revelation, authority, and the force of long tradition can play no role in our understanding of objective reality, should not play any role, at least, of what exists in the reality that we share. But those things are the only alternative to sense perceptions that are observer independent. We certainly cannot say that how things seem to someone or what it is like for any specific person, as I said, referring to dreams, that should be the standard of objective reality. But they are, in fact, a standard of subjective reality, and that, of course, as we often say, that is the province of religion. There are also quite a few self-important people who construct ridiculous syllogisms that make it appear that they are relying on logic. No matter how absurd the premises are, if they can make them seem plausible, then the syllogism does the work of making the desired conclusion seem irrefutable. This works similar to lengthy treatises with lots and lots of footnotes and references. Christian apologists do these debates and use this type of technique all the time. It makes them seem logically rigorous and scholarly, but here, for example, is shot off of a screenshot of a YouTube debate on the existence of the soul by the person who's arguing that the soul is real. If you run through it quickly without really examining it very closely, it may appear to be airtight. I mean, this guy presented seriously, put it out there to be critiqued. He certainly didn't expect to be contradicted because, gosh, it's a logical syllogism. It has to be true. But in reality, number one is certainly questionable. You might be one thing or you might be another, but you could also be something else altogether. And number two is certainly absurd. Lots of physical objects cannot be divided without losing their identity. You can't take an atom of some element and divide it or say that it comes in percentages or degrees. You can say it comes in amounts, but not in percentages or degrees. And number three, people, on the other hand, being made of many parts, can be divided without losing their integrity. People lose or have body parts replaced all the time. How then can someone be an all or nothing kind of thing? Even when it comes to our minds and mental experiences, would you still be you if I could somehow reach into your brain and remove your knowing that Paris is the capital of France? Did you even miss that bit of knowledge since I mentioned it earlier and then it went out of your immediate consciousness again? You don't stop being you because you can't remember something, do you? We could go on all day about how much of your physical body, your cognitive abilities, your memories, and so on are necessary or essential to you being you. And of course, we do have these natural experiments of Alzheimer's and people in cognitive decline going through this exact process. And we don't say once there's something gone that they're not themselves anymore. They're just not who they used to be. But who of us is the same as we used to be? So there's good reason for looking at these ideas in this way, as I showed earlier, despite their being thought of and having developed in the opposite order. The human brain is certainly the most amazing and complex thing we have yet discovered. I put this slide up last time in the prolegomenon. The brain does and should boggle our minds. Our understanding of the human brain is vital. Our entire view of the universe is dependent on our brain. And it's interesting that this and the prior slide were of Watson and Crick, the discoverers of the structure of DNA back in 1953, right at about this time. It was during April that they worked on and got their article published. Clearly, they thought about the next big question. Minds are what brains do. Your soul, your spirit is what your brain does. In principle, if we could figure out what a brain is doing, we could reproduce what it does. That is certainly, although a very long way off, but we already see the idea being explored in science fiction. And the other problem is, or we may say the challenge is, because part of what is so amazing about the brain is that there is no brain, there is only your brain and my brain and someone else's brain. Each of us and each of our brains is absolutely individual. We're not like coming off the assembly line of some PC or Apple Macintosh. And the logical conclusion of this, the inescapable deductive truth, if you want to come up with one, is that we are, each of us, precious, in the sense that any extremely scarce thing is precious. Every human being is one of a kind, and that is why every human being should be considered as an end in her or himself, and not merely a means to the ends of someone else or of society or of the state. Is this easy to put into practice? No, I think the existence of humans on this planet over all those many years shows that it is not. But that is what we are here to do. There is no one else to do it. And certainly no super powerful extraterrestrial or supernatural beings who can or will do it. It has to be us. And so this is what an atheist church looks like. Here's and next I'll put up our creed, but you can read that. Reality, separating the subjective from the objective and paying attention to facts and reason, and also distinguishing whether those facts and reasons are susceptible to social examination, and giving up any ideas or beliefs that we may have for better ones. We should consider any of our ideas or beliefs not as body parts, but as things to be gotten rid of as quickly as we can identify a better one, a more insightful one. And if we do have a creed, this really is it. Reason, enjoy, appreciate, and love, those are the things we ought to do for those purposes, to make sense, to pursue happiness, to find and discover and understand, appreciate the good, and to explore our meaning and purpose in our love for others and the things that we place the highest value on. And some interesting things about this date in history. In 1857, a book was published in France that set off a craze for spiritualism in that country by this guy, Allan Kardec. Spiritualism is the religion or the idea that the dead pass on, but that you can communicate with them. The same year, also this date, Clarence Darrow was born. How interesting, because Clarence Darrow was, if anything, a rationalist, very much someone who rejected the supernatural. But he was born in the same year that this book came out. This is the day the San Francisco earthquake virtually leveled that city in 1906, and together with the fires that raged afterwards, killed as many as 3,000 or more people and caused property damage of over 11 billion in today's dollars. The Richter scale had not yet been devised, but it is estimated that that quake was around 8. I've seen estimates of 7.9 to 8.3 if we still had the Richter scale. And then the 1942 Doolittle raid took place against Tokyo and 5 other Japanese cities on this date in 1942. I know at least one of us was alive during those times, and Merlin could comment. I'd be very curious as to what was happening at the time and what the culture was at that time. Anyways, these 16 U.S. bombers took off from an aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. It was trying to get within 400 miles of the Japanese, so-called, the Japanese main island, but they were spotted by a patrol boat when they were only like 600 miles out, so they had to launch kind of prematurely. But they did make it to Japan. They bombed a bunch of sites. They put the fear of the U.S. into the Japanese for the first time. And although it did not inflict serious damage on Japan, it was symbolic retribution for Pearl Harbor and sent the message that the Japanese nation was vulnerable to attack. The bombers had to be modified to fly much further than designed, and after hitting their targets, they flew onto China. 15 planes were crashed or ditched at sea, and one was able to land in the USSR, which at the time had a neutrality pact with Japanese, and so the plane was confiscated and the crew was held, but they were eventually kind of helped to escape. Of the 80 crew altogether, 16 planes, each with 5 crew members, 77 survived the mission, and 70 eventually made it back to the USA. 8 were captured by the Japanese, and 3 of those were executed. This is just a fascinating chapter in American history and part of World War II, so if you have time on your hands, check it out. And as we move on to discussion, I put this up every time now. Remember, don't let politics spoil our peace of mind, our composure, and our civility with each other. There are lots of principles of civility. I put up 16 in the past, but there's lots of other ones too. These two, respect and restraint, I think are important. First of all, we need to assume that others' intentions are good. None of us here are here to be trolling and to try to throw a hand grenade into things, and also to exercise restraint. You may have an idea or an objection, but you have to consider whether or not that's something you want to interject or add or not. Not every battle is worth fighting. Remember your tripartite Platonic person of reason and your mind guiding the 2 horses, one that's pretty wild and the other one that is also kind of subject to a lot of emotions. Remember too that we are embodied minds. With Zoom, we can see each other. We can see somebody putting their hand over their mouth like, oh my gosh, maybe I shouldn't say anything, or maybe their arms crossed if you can see enough of them. But also observe your own body language, your own posture, your own voice and physical behavior, because those are clues to your emotional state. And this is something, remember, that the driver of the chariot wants to restrain and have some control over, is the emotional state of those 2 winged steeds. Epictetus, we've had a quote from him before. I think this also is appropriate, but maybe in a way that is not necessarily appreciated. To learn the meaning of what you say and then speak. And what I want to draw attention to is learning the meaning of what you say. I don't think any of us are very good at really getting the meaning of what we say, or things that we say may mean something different to someone else that we hadn't thought of. So that's part of the purpose of discourse.
Very true.
Listen to what other people say, the meaning that they're extracting from your words, and use that to improve your words and perhaps also the concepts that you're trying to express. Finally, Freethought is not free. Please visit our website, click on the PayPal button, just contribute something. We depend on your continued support. And visit us on Facebook and Twitter. Again, we depend on your continued support. Being here is one of them, and financially is another. I would love to have one of you, give a presentation. It doesn't have to be a lengthy, involved one like I've given today. It could be just reading something. We'll get to you in a minute, Nogan, when we do the discussion. Your financial support promotes your values. Remember that. We can do together what none of us can do on our own. And of course, special discounts still going on. You don't have to tithe the 10%. You can tithe only 8%. Sarcasm, of course. Help us champion facts and reason. Help us celebrate doubt. All these people are always flogging faith. Faith is not a good thing. We want to have more people express doubt. Be a little bit more hesitant to insist that they know the absolute truth and be willing to go back and re-examine things. And if they go back and re-examine things and come back with the same conclusion, fine. But you have to go over the grounds of what you believe. It's important to know not only why some things are true, why other things are false. Demonstrate your commitment and be the future you wish to see in everything as you go through life. This is an important principle. Be the future that you wish to see. If you want things to get better, help them be better by being better. So thank you very much, and good morning. And with that, we'll move on to question and answer discussion.